Okay, so let me get this straight. The boss took some sort of risk, and I'm just supposed to give a fuck.
There's been a lot of talk lately about capitalism, about all its features and its flaws. Everyone seems to have a take on it, and it's easy to see why. In an age of shitty work and stagnant pay, more people are growing critical of it, as it's just not delivering on its promises to working Americans. One thing that's particularly bad about it is that the people who make the most amount of money through it tend to do the least amount of work. Essential workers have quite literally kept the country afloat during COVID, garnering praise for their resilience the whole way through, but are paid so poorly that most are going paycheck to paycheck with piles of debt. Meanwhile, rich businessmen have been hiding in their mansions as their employees make money for them and saw their wealth absolutely skyrocket across the pandemic, turning a crisis into an opportunity to funnel billions right up to them. Say what you will about all this, but the fact remains that workers make and bosses take. In a just world, labor would be entitled to all it creates instead of workers seeing few of the fruits of their own. The rich build their wealth not off their own blood, sweat, and tears, but through those of their employees, who tend to be much more diligent than they'll ever be. They'd be nothing without them. So it begs the question why they should keep the wealth that their workers make in the first place. Now, a common response you'll hear to all this is that entrepreneurs deserve the lion's share of profit because they take a risk. The argument goes that when creating a new business or pursuing a new investment, capitalists run a chance of losing it all if it ends up going under. They're supposed to be men of the mind, dauntless innovators that drive our society forward by betting on bold new ideas before anyone else, and whom the whole world rests upon their shoulders. While their employees might do most of the work, they don't take most of the risk as their bosses do and should not be entitled to most of the reward. At least, that's what we're told to believe. In this video, I'll be laying out my own response to this tried and tested argument. Many others have offered their 2 cents on it, but the critique I've made is a little different and worth sharing with the world. It's about time we debunk it for good, so if we ever get some smartass to pull it on you in an argument, this should fill you in on how to respond. Now without further ado, hit the like and subscribe button, and let's answer this question once and for all. The first thing worth noting is that this is a justification for the dominant socioeconomic system and the actions of the actors in charge of it. Throughout history, there have been similar sorts of excuses for previous arrangements now seen as obsolete. In slave societies, masters believed that they deserved to dominate others. Whether by nature or nurture, some people were better left as the property of better men, with even the gods of the time conveniently approving of such barbarity. In feudal societies, the ruling class of the age had a divine right of kings, and mandates sent straight from heaven to govern on God's behalf. To disobey them would be to disobey their deities, so commoners who did all the work were told that they had no choice but to suck up to them with no strings attached. In exchange for policing and protection, subjects spent their whole lives in service to a lord, who had the license to take whatever they made to use however they wanted. Both of these grounds for previous power are now rightfully seen as stupid and savage, having been done away with long ago in favor of freedom. The fact remains, however, that the ruling class will always come up with a just cause for their privilege and power. Instead of might makes right or divine obligation, the masters of the modern age excuse their position by nature of the risk that they took to get it. When taken into context and flipped on its head, that starts to sound like a half-assed rationale. Feudal lords also took an immense risk to develop their holds and rule over them. So would that have justified their spot in the feudal hierarchy? Now, I think that illustrates my point quite well. The ruling class will justify their reach by claiming it's deserved for one reason or another. So far, we've assumed that capitalists do, in fact, take a risk that their workers don't, as that's the basis for their claim to the reward. But is that true? Do capitalists really put themselves through peril that warrants the wealth they want? As it turns out, no, not by a long shot. For starters, the biggest risk that capitalists take is having to toil like the rest of us. If they start up a shop or buy up a stock that ends up going under, then they'll more likely than not be faced with a choice: work for a wage or die of destitution. That's what working Americans have to put up with every single day. Unlike capitalists, we can't have our money do all our work for us, so pursuing employment for most of our lives is a must if we want to pay our bills and feed our kids. When the main risk our bosses take is the chance of becoming one of us, you start to wonder why we, the workers, aren't getting a larger slice of the pie. Of course, that's all assuming that capitalists stand to lose much of anything in the first place. Many of them are so wealthy from the start that even the most disastrous venture would hardly leave a dent on their net worth. Quibi, a streaming service that disastrously failed within a year, got millions from investors to get off the ground, all of whom stayed as wealthy as ever when it flopped compared to the employees that got laid off with nothing to show for it. The former just moved their money elsewhere and started right back up again, while the latter found themselves back in the job hunt with a gap on their resume. For owners, a folded shop is just a hassle, but for workers, it means the loss of their livelihood. Now, in order for this argument to work well, the risk-reward relationship needs to be proportional. If you take more risk, you should get more wealth, and if you take less risk, you should get less wealth. Of course, this isn't how it works at all. In fact, it's actually the opposite, as those who get the most reward tend to take the least risk. For a mom and pop shop or a family-run diner, going bust can mean the loss of their sole source of income that can be really tough to recover. For a Fortune 500 company, the best and biggest firms on the block that have beat out their competition, financial ruin is less likely to strike them at all. And even if it did, they can always count on getting bailed out or kept afloat for being too big to fail. Wall Street took massive risks during the subprime mortgage crisis by gambling our lives away with careless financial ventures. When the bubble burst and sent us all crashing down with it, they came out of it all stronger than ever before. But please, do tell me how the money-grubbing fucks that take the risk of selling our futures off to the highest bidder deserve their wealth when it's made at our expense. This ties into my next point. For every enterprise, workers themselves carry much of the burden that comes with the risk which went into it. Think of it this way. Every time an employee takes on a job, their access to income is put right on the line. They put in all the work to pad out their resume, spend years in training, move all the way out for the chance to earn a living. But there's no guarantee any of it will turn out as planned. Once they're hired, all sorts of bad things can happen. They can get injured, they can get harassed, they can get laid off so their boss can buy back stock. At any moment and for any reason, they could lose their job and the livelihood that comes with it from decisions they have no control over. When business is good, workers are the last to prosper. But when business is bad, they're the first to suffer. Laborers don't just risk their livelihoods, they often risk their lives as well. A construction worker has a higher chance of dying on the job than a police officer while their boss sits down on a desk all day. They pay other people to risk death instead of facing it themselves. At Amazon, the massive conglomerate that's beaten out its competitors, they have a lethal workplace accident rate twice the industry average at its warehouses. In Bessemer, where they're running another union vote after illegally busting the first, multiple employees have died on the job this year alone, as they're pushed to the brink with dangerous quotas. Jeff Bezos has become the richest man in the world through this company, in large part by paying wages half as large as its unionized competitors. But despite making a fortune off of them, he's never faced a chance of death on the job as his employees have. Losing your life is a bigger risk than losing your wealth. The latter can always be remade, while the former can never be. With workplace deaths as common as they are, it's senseless to suggest that bosses take a greater risk than the employees they horribly exploit. Service workers were at the front line of the fight against COVID while porkies were off chilling in their super yachts away from any danger. If risk deserves reward, then workers take much more of it, so they deserve every last penny of the wealth that they themselves create. Now on top of all this, most firms under capitalism are what's known as limited liability companies, chartered legal entities designed to take risk away from individual capitalists. If they invest in one that ends up failing, the burden will fall on the firm itself instead of them, so they can walk away largely unscathed. Any costs that come from bankruptcy won't have to be paid out of their own pockets, and they're shielded from most of the consequences that come of it. While I think I've done a decent job laying out the problems with the risk argument so far, it's worth wrapping this up with the real silver bullet at hand. It equates capitalism with gambling. At first, you might think they're similar. Some startups succeed and become insanely rich while others fail and lose their capital, so there must be some degree of luck involved with coming out on top. Things become more complex once we look at the aggregate. If capitalists really did earn their wealth by taking risks, then almost no one would invest. Why? Because if they were compensated based on chance, with some winning and others losing, then it would be a zero-sum game like a round of poker, where there'd be a loser for every winner and the average profit rate would be stuck at zero. With an average profit rate of zero, the expected profit rate is also zero, so there would be no investment. Capitalist ideologues consistently claim that capitalism is not, in fact, a fixed pie. So it's odd how they use an argument which implicitly suggests that it is. Even if we set all that aside, equating profit with risk is fundamentally flawed. If a gambler wins at a hand of cards, is this too a profit from the reward of his risk? Or is it merely the result of someone else losing money? Similarly, if profits are the reward for taking risk, doesn't it imply that there'd be a loser in the trade? So in the end, what should socialists think of all this? I'll concede that capitalists do take some measure of risk when starting a business. There's all sorts of ways it could fail, and there's always a chance it won't take off at all. We've already discussed the issues with this argument, how the risk is never proportional to the reward, how employees take as much of it as their employers, or that the biggest risk they face is becoming a worker. Those are great and all, but they won't win over someone who's really bought into capitalism. Supporters of the system seem to see entrepreneurs as the primary drivers of progress in any given society. To them, profits are justified even if they don't come from risk because bosses are needed to have them in the first place. But of course, none of that is true. Bosses need workers, but workers don't need bosses. In fact, they can run things well without them. In 2002,
Argentina experienced a massive economic crisis brought forth by a decade of neoliberal policy that saw investors pulling out of the country at a breakneck pace. Everything from hotels to factories shut down. But instead of leaving them to rot as they're laid off and sent into poverty, workers took back their workplaces to run themselves. These reclaimed factories are directly operated by worker owners who democratically decide how they're run, all without any bosses and investors to sap up the profit that they create. All of this was highlighted in The Take, a 2004 documentary made by Naomi Klein, and almost 20 years later, many of these worker-managed firms are still up and running. They're a living testimony to the power of workers and the need for a world that's run by them. This experience and others like it shows that regardless of whatever risk capitalists might hold, they never should be in the position to take it on. In fact, they're not needed to run the economy in the first place. Instead, workers should take on all the risk and earn all of the reward, toiling on our terms and to our benefit.
We already make the world go round, risking life and limb to make wealth from nature and turn dreams into reality. Our bosses need us, but we don't need them. There's a chance of a better world without them we should come together and unite towards. It's not luck that builds wealth, it's labor, and not even the highest bet denies us of our right to reap what we sow. My name is Cascaden, and I will see you in the next video.